So in the interest, I'm going to keep the pace up because we are giving you really good value for money with 4 speakers here this morning. And the next speaker is Professor Audrey Bowen. Audrey is the Stroke Association John Marshall Memorial Professor of Neuropsychological Rehabilitation. I've been practicing that. I'm really proud of myself. She is a member of the Stroke Research Group at the University of Manchester and theme lead with responsibility for stroke in the Clark in Greater Manchester. The important thing about Audrey is that she was a co-editor of the National Clinical Guideline for Stroke, and she's currently president of the Society for Research in Rehabilitation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Avril. So I'm very pleased to be here to talk to you about what's new in terms of rehabilitation in the guideline, and it's very much on behalf of the whole Intercollegiate Stroke Working Party, which is a very lovely, very interdisciplinary group of people. I've divided this short talk into 3 parts, but they're not, don't panic, Avril, they're not 3 equal parts. Very quickly, though, I think we need to say a bit about one thing that's really new about the guideline is that this new, well, really increased focus on being patient-centred. So that focus and that structure that comes out of the guideline. Then, of course, have a look at what's actually changed, give you a couple of examples from some of the key recommendations. And the third thing, if there's a couple of minutes, and if not, I'm saying it now, there are things in the rehabilitation section of the guideline, there are recommendations that haven't changed because the evidence hasn't moved forward and it's looking quite worrying. So maybe to inspire some ideas about how are we going to actually get more evidence. When we talk about acute care and secondary care, we have a very clear understanding about when in the stroke pathway we're talking about. But of course, rehabilitation is not time-bound, and I want to assure you that the Working Party recognise this. So we have a rehabilitation chapter, chapter 4, but of course, rehabilitation is often across life. So I quite like the WHO definition of rehabilitation. There are many others, but really the point is about when you are trying to enable someone to reach optimal levels of functioning, and not just in physical, but also in, for example, social functioning, and of course, very importantly, to maintain that functioning, then the guideline needs to, and I think does, I hope you agree, reach well beyond the acute phase, right into the community, and indeed that period we call life after stroke. So the other thing is rehabilitation is acknowledged as not just being about therapy, though therapy and therapists are very important for rehab, but it's for the whole team. So hopefully when you look at the guideline, you will agree that it's even better than the 2012 guideline, and that there's been this shift, that the guideline is really now changed about following the patient pathway, literally in the sense that we rejigged the order of the chapters. But also really I think in more the, when you look particularly within chapter 4, where the working parties work very hard to make that very much more about the difficulties that a person with stroke would have, but also keep it so that it's accessible, so that the people delivering the services to people with stroke can actually use it in a meaningful way. So the so-called rehab chapter, although rehab is across the guideline, has moved from chapter 6 in 2012 to chapter 4. And chapter 4 is really more, what we did was we looked at chapter 4, it had 46 topics. Some of them were problems that people have after stroke, and some were sort of interventions. So you might get a section on continence, but then you might get sections on robotics. And we started from scratch. So we reduced that down, and we selected down to, we haven't reduced the content actually, but we've restructured. So chapter 4 on rehab now has 17 topics. And in a very fair system, we decided to be alphabetical. So they go from A, activities of daily living, arm function, through communication, cognition, communication, right through to V for vision. We brought the page numbering down. I'm not sure how we achieved that actually. And also what we tried to do was make sure that we had better completeness of the rehabilitation sections and all the sections in the guideline. So you're probably familiar with the idea that when you look at any of the guidelines, and Martin showed some there, you should see at least 4 things. You should have an introduction to the problem, so continence, a description about the difficulties of continence, how likely that is to happen. Then you should have a section on evidence to recommendations, which is a summary of the evidence that we appraised. And then the actual recommendations for clinical practice themselves. And the fourth section then, the sources that map the evidence back onto the recommendations. So you know, why did they make this recommendation? Was it based on a systematic review, a randomized trial, or was it based on the consensus opinion? And many sections in the guideline will also have a fifth, they'll have an implications. In the rehabilitation chapter, in chapter 4, we felt it was actually turning out to be a bit repetitive for some reason. And so what we did instead, broke the rules, and at the end of chapter 4, there is a collective section on implications for rehabilitation. So the guideline, as you'll know, the full guideline that we're talking about has been out now since October. It has over 400 recommendations. Marnie's going to talk to you about the wonderful Easy Read guideline. I won't say any more. But as you will know from launched, and there's copies available down in the exhibition hall, there are these wonderful, if I wave them, concise guides. I think there are 11 different concise guides. You can see on the screen here at the top of the pile, we have the nursing concise guide. So these are new and very valuable. Also, what is new for rehab in terms of concise guides? Well, we have a new concise guide. We have one for orthoptics this time, for the first time, which is great to have. The other thing about the concise guides, I guess, is that previously some of them were really quite long. And what you will probably have noticed is now everybody has been extremely good, and everybody has confined their concise guide to 4 sides of A4, a nice glossy brochure. So some of them have come down from 8 sides down to 4. The caveat to that, I guess, and there's a sort of health warning at the beginning of them, it tells you that you must read the full, start with this, but you must read the full guideline. Don't read this in isolation. So make sure your staff and your students don't think all they need to do is the 4 pages of concise guide. When you look within the guideline, before you get to all the chapters, when you have that introduction section, you will see that there is what's new in the guideline, and there's a top 30 recommendations as well. And so there are, in the guideline, we've actually we've picked out 9 topics that we thought were new and worth drawing your attention to. Martin's talked about some of these, of course, in the acute. And in terms of rehabilitation, you can see that 4 of those 9 definitely fit into the rehab camp. I'm going to mention psychology and early mobilization here, but draw your attention to others. This, I think, is the key. This will take me a couple of minutes, this slide. This is probably really quite important. When you look through the key recommendations, of which there are 30 of the over 400, you can badge at least 12 of them as really coming out as talking about rehabilitation. They, almost all of them now are new, have been updated. There's new evidence, and I've ticked them here with green. I suppose maybe number 1, commissioning rehabilitation, was just so perfect in 2012 it didn't need changing. But everything else as you move down has been updated. So number 2 on overall commissioning of a service, number 3 on transfer of care. Where they have changed, what's new about them is the introduction of ESD into those guidelines in terms of the overall service. And for transfer of care, some more specification about early supported discharge, you know, really big topic that's been talked about at this forum, and we still don't know enough. But what we've managed to do is to put in here a clearer recommendation about referral to seeing people within 24 hours. The numbers 4 and 5 there are highlighted, work and leisure and aphasia assessment. They are new in the top 30 key recommendations for the first time. And interestingly, and you can pick me up on this when we chat in the Knowledge Hub, I mean, that's not because we've had extra new research trials that have changed the evidence. It's really more about trying to draw out things that are important, because we really do feel the key recommendations documents people will heed. When you look at number 6, life after stroke. What's changed in this is really about the fact that we previously were talking about reviews and about having a formal review, and we've been a bit more specific, hopefully more detailed, about explaining that these need to be health and social care reviews, and also about when they happen at 6 months, at a year, and annually. I'm going to move on. What I'm going to pick up in the next few slides are the last 4. Actually, I'll just have a quick mention on care homes. Care homes is throughout. It's really highlighted. You'll see we keep saying and people in care homes, and people in care homes. I think that when you search for care homes in the key recommendations, you'll see it pops up 4 times. That's quite conscious. But we're also balancing that against the fact that we appraise the very good evidence for the OTCH trial, the OT in care homes. And so we have separately in a section called Choosing Wisely, a quite clear, and in the guideline, a recommendation, mindful of that evidence about what we need, that we need to provide rehabilitation for people in care homes, but we have good evidence from OTCH that some of the rehabilitation doesn't suggest that it's actually bringing about a benefit. So we are not dodging that one. It is there. I'm going to focus then on the last 2 topics, really, about resources, psychology, and early mobilisation. So, as Martin said, actually very helpfully, what's new here then? We have a recommendation about the resources and the staffing level. We have, there's a change in that the recommendation, it used to say we should have, that stroke services should have easy access to orthoptists, and now it says, if there's an important difference, it says that orthoptists should be core members of the team, and I suspect there might be a little 5 orthoptists who are giving a little silent cheer about that. There are 2 additions, as Martin said, to the table 2.1. People tell us this was very helpful in the 2012 guideline. So psychology has been added in yellow there, and dietetics have been added as well. And I'll move on. And so what the new guideline says about psychological care is that services that people should have the services should have a comprehensive support, and that psychology should be part of the multidisciplinary team. So in chapter 3 then, so you'll notice that quite a few of these things I'm picking out are in chapter 2, which is organisation of care, and chapter 3, which is acute care, as well as chapter 4. This is probably one of the topics that we spent huge amounts of time on, and that we really valued when we went out to consultation, all of your feedback on. So in 2012, based on a feasibility trial, we had the recommendation that people with acute stroke, pretty much all people, should be mobilised within 24 hours. And that has changed, and you will know that. So now what we have is much more wordy, but it needs to be. So if we pick our way through it, now it's about that mobilisation within 24 hours should only be for the patients who require little or no assistance to mobilise. And this is based on the AVERT trial, and that patients with difficulty moving early should be mobilised, but this should typically begin between 24 and 48 hours. So still early, but what AVERT is showing us, and we've had discussions, and I believe Peter Langhorne spoke again yesterday about some more information about AVERT, is that we needed to acknowledge that there is very clear evidence from the good trial about actually doing something too early, but we have been very mindful that, as well as the main trial paper, Julie Bernhardt and team have published their dose response study, which is really about generating ideas which need to be tested further. And so we're cautious with this, but there seems to be reasonable that we should also suggest that it's not just about the timing, it's also about the frequency. And so you can see here in about the second line of this recommendation, we're suggesting that the mobilisation should be offered frequent short daily mobilisations, rather than, here you go, here's your 45 minutes of mobilising all in the one go. Okay, so that's going to be, we know, a challenge for services. And then, I'm almost at the end, Avril. What is not new, but really should be new? When you look through the guideline, you can see these phrases popping up, particularly in the psychology section, and I don't think I'm just too kind of conscious of that. You will keep seeing that it says, in terms of cognition, of mood, that there is little research, that there's an absence of new evidence, that there's insufficient, there's uncertainty, that the recommendation hasn't changed since 2012. And this is because not because they were sufficiently robust before, because they weren't. We really are still lacking some good quality trials in these important areas. But we can't make changes because we don't have any more information. So this is, something that we really need to acknowledge and do something about. It's not just in psychology, of course. And we haven't got time for me to give you a big list of all the areas where there are important evidence gaps, but I'll make a start. Communication, continence, driving, fatigue, mental capacity, pain, sex, work, and of course carers, self-management, life after stroke, and so on. We have had a great 4 years. There have been some wonderful trials in rehabilitation around supporting carers, around OT, around mobilisation and so on. But we actually we're lagging behind. We need more. So we really need some sort of a plan of action to actually get that research into going, funded. And yesterday it was very interesting. A few of us met with Phil Clatworthy, who has a rehabilitation lead post now within the NIHR research network, and started to think about how can we actually manage to get NIHR to put out some sensible commissioning calls so that they will fund some of the rehab trials that we need to do. So my final slide is really just to say the title of the talk was What's New in Rehabilitation, and the short answer was quite a lot, really quite a lot, which is great to see. We really are grateful for the teamwork that has enabled this to come about, and that's from the Working Party, but also from the reviewers that worked with each of the representatives on the Working Party from all your colleges and organisations, and from all of you who took part in the public consultation. It has led us to have, I hope you agree, a much better patient-centred focus. We've got some good consensus level guideline recommendations where we don't have stronger evidence, but we also are beginning to build some quite definite recommendations. Now the flip side is, some of these recommendations, such as the mobilisation, are sort of difficult to swallow. They go against expectations. But difficulty never stopped anyone in rehabilitation. That's what we're about, isn't it? So that's not going to be a problem, is it? But what is a problem I'm worried about, I fret a lot, is that there is not a lot new coming through, particularly around psychological research. And so I really think we need to turn this from a problem into a plan of action. Thank you very much for your attention.